Welcome to Section 2, Implement Selecting NPCs Using Mouse Input. In this section, we're going to take a look at modifying our top-down character template class to better serve as a basis for an infantry unit. We'll also be implementing selection for NPCs using mouse input, and finally we'll be utilizing material instancing and decals for our user interface feedback for our mouse input. Video 2.1 Modifying top-down character template class to serve as basis for an infantry unit. In this video, we're going to begin taking our top-down character blueprint class that came with a top-down template, and we're going to start modifying it to become an infantry unit for our RTS game. So the very first thing we want to do is actually take this top-down character and rename it, because it's not going to be a top-down character anymore, it's going to be our infantry character. So if we right click on this and click rename, we can rename this as infantry character. And I like to do just infantry underscore car, C-H-A-R, just to indicate that this is a character. So we'll go ahead and rename that. Now once that's renamed, it will actually have some references changed. So what I like to do is to always go up one folder, and inside of our blueprints folder where we just were, we're going to right click on this and just say fix up redirectors in folder. Sometimes the engine will create these small redirector files so that if a name change happens or a class file name change happens, then it will know where to look for the new name. But those files can kind of start cluttering up your project if you don't go ahead and take care of them regularly. So with our class renamed, let's go ahead and double click to open this up. And there are a few things that we need to change. So the first thing is, you can see there's quite a bit of code here, and this code is all part of the template, the top-down template. And actually all of this code has to deal with the camera system, which we're not actually going to be using a camera associated with our infantry character. So we can actually zoom all the way out and highlight all of this code and just delete it, because we don't need it. So once we've deleted it, go ahead and click compile and save. And the next thing you need to do is go into the viewport, and you see we have our character here, but if we look up in the air, we have these two cameras up here. There's a VR camera and then a standard just camera 1 camera. So we actually don't need either of these or this spring arm, so we can actually delete these components as well. So there's two spring arms and two cameras. And again, we don't need those because this character is just going to be running around the ground in our level. We're not actually going to be following them with a particular camera just for this unit. So with those removed, go ahead and click compile and save again. So those are the first couple things we need to do. Now there's two other things that we need to do to really prepare this character to be able to move on to the next thing we want to do, which is to select this character is the next thing we're going to be doing. So the first thing we need to do though is be able to actually give the command to select something in our RTS game. So to do that, we're going to go back to our action mappings. So we need to do that by just going up into our menu for project settings. So on macOS it's under edit project settings. If you're on Windows, the menus will be above the tabs. So in our project settings, we need to go to the input section under engine. And we already have several axis and action mappings. We've been in here a few times this series already. We're going to add another action mapping. And this action mapping we're going to call select. And I'm just going to map this to my left mouse button. And this will allow us to send this select event anytime that we have our left mouse button pressed. Now we're not going to actually implement that particular event in this video, but we will be using this action mapping event quite a bit going forward. So with that set, again, just a reminder, there's no save button inside of the project settings. Any changes you make are automatically saved. So if you do want to back up these settings, you can use the export feature here, which will export these into an INI file. and then you can import them later into either another project or into a fresh new project if you want to keep the same mapping and axis and action mapping names and settings. Let's go ahead and close our project settings since we don't need that open anymore. Now the next thing we want to do is we're talking about selecting the character as something that we want to do. And there's other things that we're going to want to do with our character as well, with this particular unit character and with other units in the future. So in order to do that, we want a standard interface to be able to send messages to our units. Use a thing called a blueprint interface to be able to do that. So we're going to go ahead and create a blueprint interface, and we can just do that inside of our blueprints folder against it under content top-down BP blueprints. So if we right click and go into the blueprints section underneath the advanced asset section, under blueprints there is a blueprint interface. Now I always name my interfaces with BPI, stands for blueprint interface, and then I try to then give it a descriptive name. In this case, this is going to be the interface for our units. So I'm just going to, for example, an infantry unit or a tank unit or any other kind of unit that you're going to use in an RTS game. So I'm going to call this BPI unit. So this is going to be the interface that I use to talk to a unit, to be able to send messages to it or ask questions of it. So the next video we're doing is actually about selecting units and characters in our game. So let's go ahead and open our BPI unit interface, and we're going to add a couple interface messages. Now this probably looks very different than any of the blueprint you've seen if you haven't worked with interfaces before. So what this is we're going to create a list of functions that we're going to then guarantee that any blueprint that uses this interface will respond to those functions. This is a great way to actually reduce the overhead of having to cast a lot in the engine. If you're familiar with having to cast say an actor to a particular subclass of actor, you can get around that by having that actor implement an interface, and then you can just send the interface message to it as opposed to having to cast to then send a message to it otherwise. So the first time you open a blueprint interface, it actually already has a function ready for you to rename it. So let's go ahead and rename this as select. So you'll notice we're using the same name, a very similar name as to the action mapping that we used. That's because these are going to line up. So when we have that action mapping come down and say select, we'll be able to send this select command to a particular unit or even a group or several units at once. So with the select, this is actually not going to have any inputs and outputs. So this is going to end up just being basically an event that we can send to a particular blueprint that implements this interface. Now one thing I always like to do as well with my interfaces, I like to set the category of all the functions inside to the name of the interface. So that way later if I'm looking for a particular function, I can just search for the interface name and be able to find it. So in this case it's BPI_unit. And that will give us the category. Now we do want to do actually one other function, and this one's actually going to ask a question of the unit in essence. So we're going to be able to call this function and get some information back. And it has to do with selection as well, and it's going to be a function called isSelected. So this is going to be a way to ask a unit if it is selected, and then be able to make a determination based on if a unit is or is not selected at any given instance. So this is actually going to return a value, this output value. So we're going to make a new output, and it defaults to being a Boolean value, which works perfectly because that's what we want this to be. And we're going to call this bSelected. Now the reason we put B is it's a naming convention for Unreal Engine 4 variables that a Boolean value always is preceded by a lowercase b. Now you'll notice there is no lowercase b in this return node, and that's because the engine is smart enough to know to parse that out when it's displaying. And it's not required to have a lowercase b, but it's just a naming convention that's been around the engine for quite some time. So have this as bSelected, and don't forget to set your category. We're going to set it to BPI unit so everything's nice and categorized. Now go ahead and click compile and save, and you do have to compile your interface blueprints. It's just like any other blueprint. You won't pick up any changes until you've compiled and saved them. Now it's all well and good that we've made this interface, but the last thing we want to do in this video is actually implement the interface, or tell rather the blueprint that it's implementing an interface. So if we go to our infantry car, our infantry character, if we go to the class settings tab, inside here there's an interfaces section here for both implemented interfaces as well as inherited interfaces. So you can actually inherit interfaces. So if this will happen to be a subclass of something else, maybe you have more than one infantry character, a ranged character, and a melee character, for example, then you could subclass one off of the other, and they would inherit any interfaces. So I'm going to click this Add button, and you can see there's already several interfaces in this engine, and we're going to click our BPI unit interface. So what this does is it adds this interface to our character, and you'll also see we get an interfaces section here under my blueprint. This will show any interfaces that actually return a value, and we're going to implement this interface